Hey guys, and welcome to this edition of Scruff's Garage. So today's project, or this may end up being more than a day, but the project at hand, I've got my 97 TJ that I picked up recently. This has got the 4-liter inline 6 with the manual transmission. I've started working through some of the oil leaks, one of which the project today is to do the rear main seal and replace the oil pan gasket. It's pretty common on these. So a few weeks ago I sprayed some degreaser down there just to try to clean it up a bit. The valve cover gasket had been leaking as well. That's covered in a separate video. But the whole engine block back there is pretty greasy and oily. So I sprayed some degreaser on it to get me started. It makes it a little bit easier to work. But today's project is working on the rear main seal and the oil pan gasket. So I have the Fel-Pro Oil Pan Gasket, which includes their little what they call snap ups. We'll talk about those as we get into it, but it helps hold the oil pan gasket and pan in place. Should make life a lot easier. And then of course we've got the rear main seal as well. This is the two-piece design. This is from Fel-Pro as well. So let's dive into it. Okay, I'll try to position this as we go along. Hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm working on, but just for starters, you can see the oil pan is pretty oily. I've already drained the oil. And like I said, sprayed some degreaser in there. It's still fairly greasy up there, but we'll tackle that as we go along. But step one, we'll be getting the oil pan down. Now I've read a lot of people say need to drop the exhaust. I'm going to try at least initially to see if I can get it down. I did go ahead and spray some penetrant oil on the header connection there just to see if that would come loose if and when I need to do that. I'd like to avoid it if I can, but we'll see. Same thing with the starter. I've read mixed opinions. Some people say they got it down without dropping the starter. I'll take it out if I have to, but I'm going to initially try to skip that step. Okay, so we'll check in. So status update, I've got the oil pan down, but let's talk about what it took to get to that point. Taking out the oil pan bolts, not too hard. I would recommend, so I used the box that the rear main, that the oil pan gasket came in. Actually laid the gasket over it and kind of traced it out and marked off where each bolt that I took out, where did it come from. Most of these bolts are the same. The ones that are different are the ones I put a square around. There's 2 in the front and 2 in the back. The rest of these are the 1/4 20. It's important to keep up with that. These will get a different torque spec. I believe these are 11 foot-pounds, where these are going to be 7. And though it may not make any difference, some of these 1/4 20s have a stud on them. They're all the same length on the block side, from what I can tell, and they're all the same thread size. But like I said, some of them have a stud, so obviously my plan is to put them back exactly as I took them out. So you can do something like that. That'll help you keep up with it. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that I was going to try to take this oil pan down without taking down the exhaust pipe. That is absolutely not possible. You have to get that forward and down a little bit to get clearance to get the oil pan down. So for me, I had to take the 2 bolts loose there, the collector, and then back here at just in front of the muffler, probably can't see that too well, there's a bolt there. There's an exhaust hanger there. I sprayed some lubricant in there and then put a pry bar between the skid plate. Put a pry bar between the skid plate and that hanger, and I pried it forward while pulling down on this front section so that it would get some clearance. And it doesn't have to come down completely, but you do have to get it forward and down some to get clearance to drop that oil pan. Now for me, I didn't have to take the starter down. I left that in place. That didn't seem to be too big of a deal. I could get to all of the oil pan bolts and get everything down. The next step is to take the nuts off of this girdle that goes to the lower bearing caps. We'll take off all of those nuts. We're going to take the whole thing off. And then you can see I still have the old oil pan gasket in place. That will come down. And then I'll need to clean that block surface so that we have a nice sealing surface for the new gasket to go up against. While you're down here, of course, check your oil pump pickup tube. Make sure there's not a bunch of chunks of something in there. If you found this was all plugged up, would be an indication you've got some other issues. Okay, so I've got the girdle taken down, took the oil pan gasket off. I cleaned it up a little bit. We'll do a final wipe down before we put the new gasket on. But now we need to take down this rear bearing cap because the top half of the rear main seal is above it. So these bearing caps, I think they're something like 80 foot-pounds, so it's going to be on there fairly tight. You'll probably want a breaker bar to help break these things loose. All right, and then to get this bearing cap loose, may have to pry it a little bit. Let's see. There we go. And as you see, there's some oil coming out of the oil passage in the crank. So we're going to have to let that drip out for a second so I have a decent place to work without oil dripping in my face. But we got the bearing cap off, so that's step one. So you can see the top half in orange there. That's the top half of the rear main seal. We need to push it up on one side or the other to get it to rotate out. You want to be very careful not to mar the surface of the block or where that gasket rads, because you'll affect the sealing surface. Have a very narrow punch. You got to be careful with this because it's metal. Generally, if you can just get it started, it will come on out. Have to be very, very careful with this. A brass punch would be better. Okay, so skip ahead half an hour. I've been very gently tapping on the edge of the rear main seal. When you get this out, you'll be able to see there's a metal ring in there. If you just push on the rubber part of the seal, you just deform the seal. But that metal ring is rigid and helps you to finally get it to move. So I finally tapped it and it's moved a little bit. So let's see if I can. A brass punch would be much better to use, but of course I didn't have one. Oh yeah, here we go. There we go. It's coming around. And there we go, it's out. Pay attention to, hopefully my head's not in the way, that the ridge in the seal is facing towards the front of the motor. So when we go to put this back in, we'll have to make sure it goes in the same way. Okay, so this is our rear main bearing cap. We've removed the rear main seal from the top half of the block. Now we have to get it out of this rear bearing cap. So I think it depends on what year Jeep you have. Mine is a 97, so it has these kind of dog ear ends on it. I think the later ones don't have that. So just make sure you get the right seal for your application. My old seal pretty well stuck in here, and yours is likely to be as well. So what I did, I ripped off the little ear off of one side, then I stood it up on end, and I used that punch that I was using earlier to hit it this way to help bend in one end of the seal. And now it gives me something I can grip with a pair of pliers. There we go. So that's out. We'll need to clean up the inside of this In the instructions on the Fel-Pro, it says to remove burrs from the inside diameter of the block and the cap seal. And if you feel just inside that lip there, hopefully you can see that, there's just a little bit of a machining burr. So I'm going to try to clean that up just a bit. It does call out, you're not trying to put a chamfer on that edge, you just want to clean up the burr. And I think that's to help keep from cutting the seal when you put the new one in. So I'm going to work on getting this cleaned up, and then we'll put our seal in. Okay, so I spent quite a bit of time with the razor blade and a scraper cleaning out the groove that the rear main seal will fit into, clean off this surface here as well. Obviously this is a machine surface, so it's important that that sits flat. Also clean off the bottom side. The oil pan and gasket will seal against this as well, so you want to make sure that's free of debris. I used a light grit sandpaper just to take the machining burr off of that edge as the instructions called out. So this seal can only go in one direction, and it just drops in here. Make sure it's seated all the way around. I've seen some videos where guys put RTV in and around these dog ears. Fel-Pro doesn't call out doing that, and I didn't see that in the factory service manual either. And I can tell you from cleaning this up, if you pack a bunch of RTV in there, it's a pain to clean up if you ever have to go back into this. The other thing it does call out, however, is using anaerobic an anaerobic gasket maker, which is different than RTV. This cures in the absence of oxygen and is typically used to seal between machine surfaces where there's very little clearance in there, and you don't want to add clearance. If you packed a bunch of RTV on this, you want to change this bearing clearance. So they recommend it's in the factory service manual, running a bead along this edge and along this edge, and I may do just a bit there as well. Fel-Pro has a nice video where they talk about these two-piece rear main seals, and they demonstrate that as well. So, and a little bit goes a long way, because like I said, this is a machine surface. When this gets clamped together, it spreads it out. I'm going to give this bearing cap one last wipe down, make sure there's no debris there, and then we're going to apply a little bit of assembly lube. You could also use motor oil. It depends on how soon you think you'll be starting this motor. Then we're also going to apply some to the bearing lip, or to the seal, lip of the seal, I should say. All right, that should do what we need. So we'll take this back over to the Jeep and get it installed. All right, so we're ready to reinstall the upper piece of the rear main seal. Make sure you've cleaned off this whole area, make sure there's no grit or grime. Fel-Pro gives you this little tool. It's almost like a little shoehorn to help get the edge started, and make sure we've got this oriented correctly. The groove in the seal goes towards the front of the engine. Make sure you apply some assembly lube or motor oil to the lip of the seal. There we go. Hopefully you can see how that little tool helps keep the edge of the seal from getting cut while you're pushing it in place. That machine surface of the block can be sharp. The last little bit, you may need a punch. Put just a bit of assembly lube on the bottom of the crank. And we'll put this up into place. Okay, so we've got the bearing cap seated. So now we need to torque this to 80 foot-pounds, but we're not going to jump straight to 80. I'll start with maybe 50, make sure everything is seated properly, then we'll step it up in increments. There's 50. That was 65. Now we'll go for 80. You see just a tiny bit of that anaerobic sealer oozing out. Perfect. Okay, so the rear main seal is in, the rear main bearing cap is in, and the bearing cap brace is in. These nuts get tightened to 35 foot-pounds. Nothing too special about those. Now we're ready to do the oil pan gasket. So it's a one-piece oil pan gasket. However, when you get to spots like back here at the rear bearing cap, this is basically a 90-degree machine surface between the block and the cap and where the pan's going to sit. So they recommend doing a small bead of RTV along here to help in that corner. So just a little bit, you don't have to go crazy. Same thing on both sides of that bearing cap. So we're looking at the front of the motor, right? You see the timing chain. So this is the front timing cover. Where that timing cover meets the block, that's a machine surface, and they're not always perfectly flat. And you can feel just a bit of a step there. So again, they recommend doing a small, 1/8 to 1/4 inch bead of RTV along that, where those two surfaces come together. And that will fill any imperfection between the pre-molded gasket and those engine surfaces. I'll show you one more thing. Included with the Fel-Pro Oil Pan Gasket set are these little tools. They call them snap-ups. These will thread into the block where the 5/16 bolts go. So there's 2 in the front and 2 in the rear. They have a step to them which will allow both the oil pan gasket and then the oil pan to push up past that and kind of snap into place. And that will hold the pan gasket and the pan up against the block while you can get some of these other bolts started. So that should make life significantly easier than trying to hold the pan and the gasket with one hand while you try to get bolts started. This is nothing short of genius. So you'll see those as I use them, but I thought this might be a chance for you to see them up close. I'll also call out while we're over here, the 1/4 inch oil pan bolts go to 84 inch-pounds, which is about 7 foot-pounds. The 4 of the 5/16 bolts are 132 inch-pounds, which would be 11 foot-pounds. And just to reiterate, we talked about it earlier, the main bearing bolts, those two go to 80 foot-pounds, and those bearing cap brace, the nuts, go to 35 foot-pounds. So hopefully you can see in there how the snap up holds the pan. On this end at the back of the motor, because I didn't take the starter out, I needed to be able to move the pan around to get it around that starter, so I had to take that snap up out, which made it a bit more challenging, but I've still got 3 of them in place. So now I'm going to run in the 1/4 inch bolts, and then we'll put in the 5/16 and go through the torque spec. Okay, I've got the oil pan back on. All the oil pan bolts are torqued. It's a tough angle for you to be able to see much, but just trust me that the oil pan is back on. You'll also need to reattach the exhaust, which requires a pry bar to kind of move things back around. One tip, when I had been prying on the exhaust to get it to move forward towards the front of the Jeep to get it off the exhaust manifold, what I didn't realize at the time is that this exhaust hanger here in the back had flipped vertical, which raises the tailpipe. When I went to move the exhaust back, it was still flipped up and causing the tailpipe. I've got a hitch back here, and it was causing the tailpipe to hit the hitch, and I couldn't move it back far enough to get the kind of the head pipe onto the exhaust manifold. Once I figured out what had happened here, it was just a matter of flipping this kind of back down, and then that dropped the exhaust down, and I could move it the rest of the way. So if you get hung up on the exhaust, check back here and see if any of your exhaust hangers have flipped upwards, and that may be causing you some problems. Okay, there you go. So that's how you do the rear main seal and the oil pan gasket. Pretty common to repair on the inline 6. Like I said, mine's a 97 TJ. As you go to the later models, I don't know, forgive me, I forget the exact year, somewhere around 2000 and up, that rear main seal changes a little bit, so pay attention to what model year you have. There could be some slight variances from what you saw me do, but the general process is still the same. So I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions that I can answer, feel free to post in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning in to this edition of Scruff's Garage. I'll see you next time.